Mason Reed stood in the rain-soaked driveway, staring at the eviction notice trembling in his hands, when he heard his 7-year-old daughter's voice cut through the storm. "Daddy, are we going to be homeless again?" Through the wall of their crumbling rental house, a stranger listened. Victoria Hale, the billionaire next door who had spent years building walls around her heart, suddenly unable to ignore the sound of a man crying alone in his kitchen at 3 in the morning. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know he'd once designed buildings that changed skylines. She only knew the sound of someone breaking. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't walk away. If you want to know how a broken architect and a woman who swore never to trust again found something worth fighting for, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The house on Maple Ridge had been abandoned for 3 years before Mason Reed signed the lease. The landlord didn't ask questions, just took the first month's rent in cash and handed over keys that stuck in locks swollen with rust. Mason didn't care. It had 4 walls, a roof that mostly didn't leak, and it was cheap enough that he could still afford to feed Sophie. He pulled the truck into the driveway just after dark, gravel crunching under bald tires. Sophie was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window, breath fogging the glass. 7 years old, and already she'd learned to sleep through anything: motels, shelters, the back seat of this dying truck. Mason cut the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the peeling paint and sagging porch steps. This was it. This was what his life had become. He carried Sophie inside first, her small body limp and trusting in his arms. The house smelled like mildew and old carpet. He laid her down on the bare mattress he'd dragged in earlier, tucked a blanket around her shoulders, and stood there watching her breathe. She looked so much like her mother. Same dark hair, same small chin. Rachel had been gone 4 years now, a brain aneurysm that took her in the middle of the night while Sophie slept in the next room. Mason had been on a job site 200 miles away. By the time he got home, his wife was already in the ground and his daughter was staying with neighbors who looked at him like he'd done something wrong by not being there. Maybe he had. He walked back outside and started unloading boxes from the truck bed. They didn't have much. Clothes, a few kitchen things, Sophie's stuffed rabbit that was missing one ear. Everything else had been sold or left behind in the string of places they'd lived since everything fell apart. "Need help with that? Whoop-I? Mom? Whoa." Mason turned, box in hand. A woman stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't hostile either. She was maybe 30, dressed in dark jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Mason's entire wardrobe. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face sharp and angular in the porch light from the house next door. "I'm good," Mason said, turning back to the truck. "You just move in?" "But, yeah, Belsorcier. Didn't think anyone would rent that place. It's been empty a long time." Mason pulled another box from the truck bed, felt the bottom start to give way, and caught the contents before they spilled onto the gravel. "Well, someone did." The woman watched him for another moment, then nodded. "Welcome to the neighborhood, I guess." She walked back toward her house, a renovated Victorian with fresh paint and landscaping that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Mason watched her go, then carried the box inside. He didn't need neighbors. He didn't need friends. He just needed to keep his head down, work his shifts at the garage, and make sure Sophie had enough to eat. That was the plan. That was all he had left. The garage where Mason worked was called Jimmy's Auto Repair, though Jimmy had been dead for 6 years and his son Dale ran the place now. Dale was 26, mean when he drank, and liked reminding everyone that he was the boss. Mason showed up at 6 every morning, changed oil, rotated tires, fixed brake lines, and kept his mouth shut. The other mechanics, Tony and Marcus, had been there for years. They didn't talk to Mason much. He was the new guy, the one who showed up out of nowhere and took the lowest paying position without complaint. Mason didn't mind the silence. It was better than the questions. "Reed, you got a customer up front," Dale called from the office one afternoon. "Says his transmission's slipping." Mason wiped his hands on a rag and walked into the waiting area. A man in his 50s stood by the counter, expensive watch, clean hands. The kind of guy who'd never changed his own oil in his life. "You the mechanic?" the man asked. "Yeah, you see. My car's making a grinding noise when I shift gears. How long to fix it?" Mason walked outside and looked at the car, a late model BMW, barely a scratch on it. He popped the hood, checked the fluid levels, then slid underneath on a creeper and inspected the transmission pan. When he came back up, the man was standing there with his arms crossed. "Your transmission fluid's low and dirty," Mason said. "Probably hasn't been changed in 40,000 miles. I can flush it and refill it, but if the grinding doesn't stop, you're looking at a full rebuild." "How much?" "Flush and fill, 300. Rebuild, couple thousand." The man's face tightened. 300 to change the fluid? That's the price. That's robbery. Mason shrugged. "Take it somewhere else, then." "Well," the man stared at him for a long moment, then pulled out his wallet and slapped down a credit card. "Just do it." Mason ran the card, handed it back, and got to work. An hour later, the car was done. The man drove off without a word, and Mason went back to the bay where Tony was replacing a muffler. "You really tell that guy it'd cost $2,000 to rebuild his transmission?" Tony asked, not looking up. "If it needs it, yeah." Tony snorted. "Dale's gonna love that. Rich guys don't like hearing the truth." "Rich guys can afford it." "Maybe. But you're not making friends, Reed." Mason didn't answer. He didn't come here to make friends. Victoria Hale didn't usually pay attention to her neighbors. The house on Maple Ridge had been a calculated purchase, undervalued property in a neighborhood undergoing slow gentrification. She'd bought it, renovated it, and lived there alone while her investment portfolio grew in markets most people couldn't even pronounce. She was good at making money. She was good at staying detached. She was good at not needing anyone. But the man next door was hard to ignore. She'd see him leaving for work before dawn, coming home after dark, always moving with the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just a long shift. He had a daughter. Victoria had seen her a few times. A small girl with tangled hair who sat on the porch steps and drew pictures in a notebook, while her father unloaded groceries or fixed the broken railing with spare wood and mismatched nails. Victoria told herself it wasn't her business. She had conference calls with investors in Singapore, portfolio reviews with hedge fund managers, and a meeting in San Francisco next week that could double her quarterly returns. She didn't have time to worry about the struggling single father next door. But then, late one Thursday night, she heard him crying. Victoria had been working in her home office, reviewing contracts on her laptop, when the sound filtered through the wall. It was quiet at first, just a muffled, broken noise that could have been anything. But then it came again, louder, more raw. A man's voice, choked and shaking, trying to hold itself together and failing. Victoria sat very still, her fingers frozen on the keyboard. She heard a chair scrape across the floor, heard something heavy, maybe a fist, hit a table, heard the unmistakable sound of someone falling apart when they thought no one was listening. She closed her laptop and sat there in the dark, staring at the wall. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But she knew that sound. She'd made it herself once, years ago, when her ex-husband's lawyers had gutted her in court and left her with nothing but a business card and a shattered belief that love was anything but leverage. Victoria stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the house next door. The lights were off, except for a dim glow in the kitchen. She could see his shadow through the thin curtains, hunched over the table, shoulders shaking. She turned away and went to bed. But she didn't sleep. Sophie Reed was small for 7, with dark eyes that watched everything and a voice that was quieter than it should have been. She didn't talk much at school. She didn't have friends. When the other kids played at recess, Sophie sat on the swings and kicked her feet, staring at the ground. Her teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, had called Mason in for a meeting 2 weeks after they'd moved to Maple Ridge. "I'm concerned about Sophie," Mrs. Alvarez had said, sitting across from Mason in a classroom that smelled like crayons and disinfectant. "She's very withdrawn. She doesn't participate in group activities, and she doesn't seem to connect with the other children." Mason had nodded, hands folded in his lap. "She's been through a lot." "I understand. Losing her mother must have been incredibly difficult." "It was." "Has she talked to anyone? A counselor, maybe?" "No." Mason had looked at the floor. "We've moved around a lot. Haven't really had the chance." Mrs. Alvarez had leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Mr. Reed, I'm not judging you. I just want to make sure Sophie has the support she needs. There are resources available." "We're fine," Mason had said, standing up. "Thanks for your time." He'd left before she could say anything else. Now, 3 weeks later, Sophie sat on the porch steps after school, drawing in her notebook while Mason worked on fixing the front door that wouldn't close all the way. The wood had warped, and the frame was crooked, but he thought he could shave it down and make it fit. "What are you drawing?" Mason asked, glancing over at her. Sophie held up the notebook. It was a picture of a house, their house, with flowers in the yard and curtains in the windows. In the drawing, the porch wasn't broken and the paint wasn't peeling. "That's beautiful, Soph." She looked at the picture, then back at him. "Do you think we'll stay here?" Mason's chest tightened. "Yeah, kiddo, we'll stay." "You said that last time." "I know, but this time's different." "Mom, cha to us." Sophie didn't look convinced, but she went back to her drawing. Mason turned back to the door and kept sanding, jaw clenched, trying not to think about how many times he'd made promises he couldn't keep. The following Monday, Mason's shift at the garage started the same as every other. He clocked in, pulled on his coveralls, and started working on a rotation. 4 tires, standard alignment, easy work. Mindless. Dale wandered into the bay around 10, coffee in hand, looking hungover. "Got a job for you this afternoon," Dale said. "Lady's got a Lexus with a check engine light. Probably nothing, but she's paranoid. Run the diagnostic and tell her it's fine. What if it's not fine?" What? Brownson. Dale gave him a look. "Then you tell her it is anyway. I'm not losing a customer because you want to be honest." Mason stared at him. "You want me to lie? I want you to keep your job. There's a difference." Mason turned back to the tire machine and didn't answer. At 2 in the afternoon, the Lexus came in. A woman in her 40s, stressed, talking fast. Mason hooked up the diagnostic scanner and pulled the codes. The computer flagged an oxygen sensor issue. Minor, fixable, but real. He walked back into the waiting area where Dale was talking to the woman. "It's the O2 sensor, man," Mason said. "It's reading lean. I can replace it, but it'll take an hour and cost about $250. The woman's face fell. $250? Dale shot Mason a look, then turned to the woman with a smile. "Actually, we can probably reset it for you. Sometimes these things just glitch. No charge." "Really?" The woman looked relieved. "Yeah, give us 10 minutes. Dale walked Mason back into the bay and shoved him toward the car. "What the hell is wrong with you? The sensor's bad. If we don't fix it, she'll be back in a month." "That's her problem. Reset the code and send her on her way." "That's fraud." Dale stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "You do what I tell you, or you're done here. Understand?" "Bum man. Mais." Mason looked at him for a long moment, then walked to the car, reset the code, and handed the woman her keys. She thanked him, smiling, and drove away. Mason watched her go, feeling something hard and bitter settle in his stomach. Tony walked past, shaking his head. "Told you, man. This place doesn't care about the truth." Mason didn't answer. He went back to work. Shipam. That night, Victoria heard the crying again. She was making tea in her kitchen when the sound came through the wall, quieter this time, but unmistakable. She stood there with the kettle in her hand, staring at the dark window, and before she could talk herself out of it, she walked outside and knocked on his door. No answer. She knocked again, harder. The door opened. Mason stood there, face shadowed, eyes red. He looked at her like he wasn't sure she was real. "Are you okay?" Victoria asked. "I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." Mason's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" Victoria didn't have an answer for that. She should have walked away. She should have gone back to her house, her laptop, her carefully controlled life. But something in his face, something broken and raw and familiar, made her stay. "I heard you," she said quietly. "Through the wall, last week and tonight. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Mason stared at her, and for a moment Victoria thought he might slam the door in her face. But then his shoulders sagged, and he stepped back, letting her in. The house was barely furnished, a couch with torn fabric, a small kitchen table, boxes still stacked in the corner. A little girl was asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket. "That's Sophie," Mason said, his voice flat. "My daughter." Victoria looked at the girl, then back at Mason. "What happened to you?" Mason laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want the long version or the short version? Whichever one you need to tell. He sat down at the kitchen table, and after a moment, Victoria sat across from him. I used to be an architect, Mason said, staring at his hands. Good one, too. I worked for a firm in the city, commercial projects, housing developments, office buildings. I loved it. It was everything I'd worked for. He paused, swallowing hard. 3 years ago, I was assigned to a low-income housing project. Big development, lots of city funding, supposed to be a flagship project for affordable housing. But the contractor was cutting corners, using substandard materials, skipping inspections, falsifying reports. I found out and reported it to my boss, a guy named Gregory Bell. He was the lead investor, and he told me to keep my mouth shut. Said if I made noise, I'd lose my job. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. You didn't keep quiet. No, I went to the city, gave them everything I had. Documents, photos, emails. They opened an investigation, and the whole thing blew up. The contractor got shut down, Bell's company took a huge hit, and the project got scrapped. That sounds like you did the right thing. Mason laughed again, bitter and broken. Yeah. Except Bell had connections. He made sure the story got twisted. Suddenly, I was the whistleblower who cost the city millions. I was the guy who ruined a project that was supposed to help poor families. My name got dragged through the press. My firm fired me, and every other firm in the state blacklisted me. I couldn't get a job designing doghouses, let alone buildings. Victoria's throat tightened. So you became a mechanic. See? Wurst. I became whatever paid the bills. I've worked construction, delivery driving, warehouse shifts. Right now, it's the garage. I take what I can get, and I keep my head down because if I don't, Sophie doesn't eat. Victoria looked at the little girl on the couch, then back at Mason. And her mother? Dead. Aneurysm, 4 years ago. I wasn't even there when it happened. His voice cracked. I wasn't there for her. And now I can barely take care of my own kid. Some father I turned out to be. Victoria didn't know what to say. She'd spent years building walls, convincing herself that people only hurt you, that trust was a weakness, that the only person you could rely on was yourself. But sitting here, looking at this man who'd lost everything because he'd told the truth, she felt something shift inside her. You're still here, Victoria said quietly. You're still fighting for her. That's more than most people would do. Mason looked at her, eyes raw and broken. It doesn't feel like enough. Victoria reached across the table and touched his hand, just for a moment, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. It's enough, she said. The next morning, Victoria woke up thinking about Mason Reed. She told herself it was just curiosity. She told herself she was only being a decent neighbor. But when she walked into her office and opened her laptop, she found herself typing his name into a search engine. The results came up immediately. News articles from 3 years ago, headlines screaming about a whistleblower who'd sabotaged a major housing project. There were photos of Mason, younger, clean-shaven, wearing a suit, standing outside a courthouse. There were quotes from Gregory Bell, calling him reckless and irresponsible. There were op-eds arguing both sides, but the loudest voices were the ones that painted Mason as the villain. Victoria kept reading, clicking through article after article, piecing together the story. The more she read, the angrier she became. Mason had been right. The contractor had cut corners. The investigation had proven it. But by the time the truth came out, the damage was already done. Bell's PR team had spun the narrative. The media had run with it, and Mason's career had been destroyed. Victoria closed the laptop and sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She knew men like Gregory Bell. She'd worked with them, invested alongside them, watched them destroy people without losing a minute of sleep. They were the ones who always won, because they had the money, the power, and the connections to rewrite history. But maybe, just this once, they didn't have to. Victoria picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Nathan Cole, a developer she'd worked with on several projects. He was one of the few people in the industry she actually trusted. She sent him a message. Need to talk. Got a project idea you might be interested in. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the house next door. Mason Reed had spent 3 years drowning. Maybe it was time someone threw him a rope. That weekend, Sophie got sick. It started as a cough on Friday night. Nothing serious, just a dry rasp that made her wince. By Saturday morning, she had a fever, and by Saturday night, Mason was pacing the kitchen, watching her sleep on the couch and trying not to panic. He didn't have insurance. He didn't have a regular doctor. If this got worse, he'd have to take her to the emergency room, and that would mean bills he couldn't pay. He pressed his hand to her forehead. She was burning up. "Hey, Soph," he whispered. "You doing okay?" She opened her eyes, glassy and unfocused. "My throat hurts." "I know, kiddo. I'm going to get you some medicine, okay? Just hang in there." He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, but when he opened it, Victoria was standing on the porch, hand raised like she'd been about to knock. "I heard Sophie coughing," Victoria said. "Is she all right?" Mason ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. "She's got a fever. I was just heading out to get her something." Victoria looked past him into the house, then back at Mason. "I can sit with her while you're gone." Mason hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but you look like you're about to collapse, and she shouldn't be alone. Go. I'll stay." Mason stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." He drove to the pharmacy, bought children's fever medicine, and a thermometer he couldn't really afford, and drove back as fast as he could. When he walked inside, Victoria was sitting on the floor next to the couch, holding Sophie's hand. "She asked for water," Victoria said quietly. "I gave her some. Hope that's okay." "Yeah, that's good." Mason knelt beside Sophie and gave her the medicine, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "You're going to be okay, Soph. I promise." Sophie looked at Victoria, then at Mason. "Is she staying?" Mason glanced at Victoria, who gave him a small, uncertain smile. "Yeah," Mason said. "She's staying." Mason shrugged. Victoria stayed until Sophie's fever broke, until her breathing evened out, and she fell into a real sleep. Mason walked her to the door, and they stood there in the dim porch light, neither of them quite sure what to say. "Thank you," Mason said finally, "for helping." Victoria shrugged. "It's what neighbors do, right? Not in my experience." She looked at him, and for the first time her expression softened. "Well, maybe you've been living in the wrong neighborhoods." Mason smiled, just a little, but it was real. Victoria turned to leave, then stopped. "Mason?" "Yeah?" "You're doing better than you think." She walked back to her house, and Mason stood there on the porch, watching her go, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, but there. Us. The following Monday, Dale fired someone. It wasn't Mason, not yet, but it was close. A guy named Carlos, who'd been at the garage for 2 years, made the mistake of telling a customer the truth about a repair Dale wanted to overcharge for. Dale called him into the office, shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, and told him to clean out his locker. Carlos left without a word, and the rest of the mechanics went back to work in silence. Mason kept his head down. He rotated tires, changed oil, fixed brake lines, and kept his mouth shut. But every time a customer asked him a question, every time Dale told him to bend the truth or skip a step, Mason felt something crack a little deeper inside him. He was 32 years old. He had a degree in architecture from a decent school. He'd designed buildings that people actually lived in. And now he was lying to strangers about their cars to keep a job that paid barely enough to survive. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Mason sat at the kitchen table and pulled out his old portfolio. He hadn't looked at it in over a year, hadn't been able to stand seeing the work he used to do, the person he used to be. He flipped through the pages slowly. Blueprints, renderings, photographs of completed projects. There was an office building in the financial district, a mixed-use development near the waterfront, a community center that had won an award. Every page was a reminder of what he'd lost. He closed the portfolio and sat there in the dark, hands trembling. A knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find Victoria standing there, holding a folder. "I need to show you something," she said. Mason let her in, and she spread the folder out on the kitchen table. Inside were printouts, articles, project proposals, financial reports. "What is this?" Mason asked. "Nathan Cole is a developer I've worked with for years," Victoria said. "He's looking for an architect to redesign a series of affordable housing projects. Real projects, not the corrupt garbage you dealt with before. I told him about you." Mason's throat tightened. Victoria, I can't. Yes, you can. Her voice was firm. I sent him your old work. He looked at it, Mason. He said it was some of the best residential design he'd seen in years. He wants to meet you. Mason stared at the papers, his mind racing. No one's going to hire me. You know what my name means in this industry. Nathan doesn't care about gossip. He cares about talent. And you have it. Mason shook his head. Even if he did hire me, what happens when Belle finds out? He'll destroy this just like he destroyed everything else. Then we make sure he can't. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes fierce. You didn't do anything wrong, Mason. You told the truth, and they punished you for it. But you're still here. You're still standing. And I think it's time you stopped hiding. Mason looked at her, then at the folder, then back at her. His hands were shaking. His chest felt tight. But somewhere, buried under all the fear and exhaustion, something sparked to life. Okay, he said quietly. I'll meet him. Victoria smiled, a real smile, not the guarded, careful expression she usually wore. Good, she said, because I already set up the meeting for Friday. Mason laughed, startled. You're serious? I'm always serious. She stood up, gathered the papers, and handed the folder to him. Read through these tonight. Nathan's going to ask you about your design philosophy, your approach to low-income housing, and what you'd do differently if you had the chance. Be ready. Mason took the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Victoria, he said, why are you doing this? She paused at the door, looking back at him. Because someone should have done it for you a long time ago. Then she was gone, and Mason was left standing in his broken kitchen, holding a folder full of second chances, trying to remember what hope felt like. Mason didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m, reading through everything Victoria had given him, project proposals, site plans, demographic studies for affordable housing communities across the state. Nathan Cole wasn't some small-time developer chasing tax credits. He was legitimate. His projects actually got built, and from what Mason could see, they were built right. By the time dawn broke, Mason had filled half a notebook with sketches and notes, design ideas he hadn't let himself think about in years, floor plans that prioritized natural light and ventilation, community spaces that didn't feel like afterthoughts, housing that treated low-income families like they deserved dignity instead of just a roof. Sophie found him there when she came downstairs, still in her pajamas, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one ear. Did you stay up all night? She asked, climbing into the chair next to him. Yeah, kiddo, I did. Are you sick? Mason smiled and pulled her onto his lap. No, I'm not sick. I'm just working on something. Sophie looked at the sketches scattered across the table. Are you drawing buildings again? Maybe. I thought you didn't do that anymore. Mason's chest tightened. He'd tried so hard to hide his past from her, to keep his failures buried where she wouldn't see them. But kids noticed everything. They always did. I used to draw buildings, Mason said carefully. Before things got hard. I stopped for a while, but maybe I can start again. Sophie studied his face with those big, serious eyes. Would that make you happy? Mason felt something break open inside him. Yeah, Soph, I think it would. She leaned against his chest, and they sat there together in the early morning light, surrounded by blueprints and half-finished dreams. At 7:30, Mason's phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Meetings at 2 on Friday. Nathan's office downtown. Don't be late. Mason stared at the message, his stomach twisting. He hadn't been downtown in 3 years. Hadn't worn anything but grease-stained coveralls and work boots. Hadn't sat across from someone who might actually believe in him. He typed back, I'll be there. Then he closed the notebook, kissed Sophie on the head, and started getting ready for another shift at the garage. 1. Dale was in a mood that Tuesday. He showed up late, eyes bloodshot, and immediately started tearing into Tony for leaving a wrench on the floor. Mason stayed out of the way, worked on an alignment, and tried not to draw attention to himself. Around noon, a woman brought in a Honda with a blown head gasket. Mason gave her the estimate, $1,500 for parts and labor, and watched her face crumble. I don't have that kind of money, she said quietly. I'm a single mom. I need this car to get to work. Mason glanced toward the office where Dale was on the phone, then back at the woman. Let me see what I can do. He walked into the bay and pulled Tony aside. Head gasket on the Honda. I'm going to use aftermarket parts and do it myself after hours. Cut the cost in half. Tony raised an eyebrow. Dale's not going to like that. Dale doesn't need to know. Man, you're asking for trouble. I'm asking you to cover for me. Can you do that or not? Tony sighed. Yeah, I'll cover, but if he finds out, he won't. Mason worked through his lunch break and stayed 2 hours after his shift ended. He replaced the head gasket, tested the engine, and had the car running smooth by 7 o'clock. When the woman came to pick it up, he charged her $700. She stared at the invoice. You said $1,500. I found a way to bring it down. Boy, toy, bashi. Her eyes filled with tears. Thank you. I don't know how to... Just take care of your car, Mason said, and drive safe. She left and Mason locked up the garage, exhausted but feeling something close to satisfaction. He didn't care if Dale found out. Some things were worth the risk. When he got home, Victoria was sitting on her porch with a glass of wine, laptop open on her knees. You're home late, she called. Mason walked over, wiping oil off his hands with a rag. Had a job to finish. Dale still treating you like garbage? Pretty much. Victoria closed the laptop. You know, in 3 days, you might not have to deal with him anymore. Mason leaned against the porch railing. Or Nathan takes one look at me and realizes I'm not worth the trouble. Stop it. Stop what? Yes, talking like you're already defeated. Victoria's voice was sharp. You haven't even met him yet, and you're already writing yourself off. You think that's what Sophie needs to see? Her father giving up before he even tries? Mason flinched. That's not fair. No. What's not fair is you pretending like you don't have talent. I've seen your work, Mason. It's good. Better than good. So stop acting like you're lucky to be alive and start acting like someone who deserves a second chance. Mason stared at her, jaw tight. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it feels like to lose everything and have people look at you like you're toxic. Victoria set down her wine glass and stood up. You're right. I don't know what that's like. But I know what it's like to rebuild from nothing. I know what it's like to have people underestimate you because they think you're weak. And I know what it's like to prove them all wrong. She walked down the porch steps until she was standing right in front of him. You're not weak, Mason. You're just scared, and that's okay. But don't let fear make you small. Mason looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Beneath the expensive clothes and the sharp edges, Victoria Hale was just as broken as he was. She'd just learned how to hide it better. Why do you care? Mason asked quietly. Victoria's expression softened. Because I spent 10 years building walls, and it didn't make me happy. It just made me alone, and I don't want that for you. Mason didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Victoria turned to go back inside, then paused. Friday, 2 o'clock. Wear something clean. And for the record, I think Nathan's going to hire you. Yeah? Yeah, Keta. She disappeared into her house, and Mason stood there on the porch, feeling something dangerous and unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that felt a lot like belief. Wednesday morning, Sophie's school called. Mrs. Alvarez again, her voice carefully neutral, asking if Mason could come in for another meeting. He told Dale he had a family emergency and left the garage at noon. The school smelled the same, crayons and floor wax and something vaguely like cafeteria food. Mrs. Alvarez met him in the hallway, and they walked to her classroom in silence. Is Sophie in trouble? Mason asked when they sat down. No, not in trouble. Mrs. Alvarez folded her hands on the desk. But I am worried about her. She's still not engaging with the other children, and her work has been concerning. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a drawing Sophie had done during art class. A house, like always, but this one was surrounded by dark scribbles, and the windows were all black. What does this mean? Mason asked, his stomach sinking. I don't know. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Has anything changed at home? Anything that might be upsetting her? Mason looked at the drawing and felt the weight of his failures pressing down on him. We've been through a lot. Moving, money problems, just life. but I've been trying to keep things stable for her. I'm sure you have, but children process trauma differently than adults. They don't always have the words to tell us what's wrong, so they show us in other ways. Mrs. Alvarez's voice was kind, but firm. Sophie needs help, Mr. Reed, professional help. I can give you some referrals. I can't afford a therapist. There are free clinics, community programs. I don't have time to drive her to appointments. I work 60 hours a week just to keep the lights on. Why? Mrs. Alvarez was quiet for a moment. Then maybe you need to ask for help. Mason stood up, taking the drawing with him. Thanks for your time. He left before she could say anything else, walked to his truck, and sat there gripping the steering wheel until his hands stopped shaking. Sophie was drawing dark houses because she was scared. Scared they'd lose their home again. Scared her father couldn't protect her. Scared the world was a place where nothing good ever lasted. And she was right to be scared because Mason didn't know how to fix any of it. He drove back to the garage and worked the rest of his shift in silence. That night, Victoria knocked on his door again. Mason opened it, exhausted, and found her holding a bag of takeout. You look like you haven't eaten, Victoria said. I'm fine. You're not fine. Let me in. Mason stepped aside, too tired to argue. Victoria walked into the kitchen and started unpacking containers. Chinese food, enough for 3 people. Sophie appeared from the living room, eyes lighting up. Is that fried rice? Sophie asked. It is, Victoria said. You like fried rice? It's my favorite. Good. Then sit down and eat. Sophie climbed into a chair and Victoria handed her a fork. Mason stood there, watching, feeling like he'd lost control of his own life. You gonna eat or just stand there? Victoria asked. Mason sat down. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and then Sophie looked at Victoria and said, Are you my dad's friend? Victoria glanced at Mason, then back at Sophie. I guess I am. He doesn't have a lot of friends. Eat. Sophie, Mason started. It's true, Sophie said matter-of-factly. We move a lot, so people don't really know us, but I think it's nice that you're here. Victoria's expression softened. I think it's nice, too. After dinner, Sophie went upstairs to get ready for bed, and Mason started cleaning up the containers. Victoria helped, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen. School called today? Mason said quietly. They're worried about Sophie, said she needs therapy. So get her therapy. I can't afford it. Victoria dried a plate and set it on the counter. What if I helped? Mason turned to look at her. No. Mason, no. I'm not taking your money. It's not about the money. It's about Sophie getting what she needs. And what am I supposed to do? Let you pay for everything while I work at a garage and pretend I'm not a failure? Victoria's eyes flashed. You're not a failure. You're a father doing the best he can. And if someone offers to help, you take it. That's not weakness. That's survival. Mason leaned against the counter, jaw clenched. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Let people in. Trust that they won't leave when things get hard. Victoria set down the dish towel and looked at him. I'm not going anywhere, Mason. You don't know that. Yes, I do. They stood there in the dim kitchen, the air between them heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Friday, Victoria said finally. 2:00. Nathan's going to offer you a job. And when he does, you're going to say yes. And then you're going to come home and take your daughter to therapy. And slowly, piece by piece, you're going to rebuild your life. Understand? Mason nodded, throat tight. Good. Victoria grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Get some sleep. You've got work in the morning? But try. Thursday was Mason's last full day at the garage before the meeting. He showed up early, worked through lunch, and tried not to think about what could go wrong tomorrow. Around 3, Dale called him into the office. Got a complaint? Dale said, leaning back in his chair. Customer says you overcharged her for a head gasket replacement last week. Mason's blood went cold. What? Woman with a Honda. She's saying you quoted her $1,500, then charged her $700 and did a shit job. Says the car's smoking again. Mason's mind raced. That's not... I looked at the invoice, Dale interrupted. You used aftermarket parts without authorization and worked off the clock. What the hell were you thinking? She couldn't afford the full repair. I was trying to help. You were trying to help? Dale laughed. You cost me $800 and made the shop look bad. That's not helping. That's stealing. I didn't steal anything. I did the work myself. On my time, in my shop, using my tools. That's theft, Reed, and I'm done with your self-righteous bullshit. Mason's chest tightened. Dale, listen. No, you listen. You're fired. Clean out your locker and get out. The words hit like a punch. Mason stood there, frozen, as Dale picked up his phone and turned away, dismissing him. Tony appeared in the doorway. Man, I'm sorry. I tried to tell him. It's fine, Mason said, his voice flat. It's not your fault. He walked to his locker, grabbed his jacket and thermos, and left without looking back. Outside, the afternoon sun was too bright, the air too warm. Mason sat in his truck, hands shaking, staring at the steering wheel. He'd been fired. Again. The meeting with Nathan was tomorrow, but now he had no income, no backup plan, nothing but a mortgage he couldn't pay and a daughter who needed therapy he couldn't afford. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. How's your day going? Mason stared at the message, then typed back, I'll tell you later. He drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat there until Sophie came home from school. Mon passe. That night, Mason told Victoria what happened. They were sitting on his porch, Sophie asleep inside, the neighborhood quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Dale's an idiot, Victoria said flatly. You're better off without him. I'm unemployed, Victoria. I've got maybe 2 months before I can't make rent. Better off doesn't feel like the right word. So tomorrow's meeting just got a lot more important. Mason laughed bitterly. Yeah, no pressure. Victoria turned to face him. Listen to me. You're going to walk into that meeting tomorrow, and you're going to show Nathan Cole exactly who you are. Not some broken-down mechanic. Not some guy who got screwed by the system. You're going to be Mason Reed, the architect who designed buildings that people actually wanted to live in. The guy who stood up to corruption even when it cost him everything. That's who you are. And that's who Nathan needs. And if he says no, then we figure out plan B. But you don't get to quit before you even try. Mason looked at her. This woman who'd appeared in his life out of nowhere and refused to let him drown. Why are you doing this? Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, because I used to be married. And when my husband left, he took everything. The house, the money, even my confidence. I spent 2 years rebuilding, and for a long time, I thought I'd done it alone. But I didn't. There were people who helped me, even when I didn't ask. And I swore that if I ever had the chance, I'd do the same for someone else. I'm not a charity case. No, you're not. You're someone who deserves a second chance, and I'm someone who has the resources to help you get it. That's not charity. That's just fairness. Mason felt something crack open in his chest. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you get the job. She stood up, and Mason walked her to the edge of his driveway. She paused before crossing to her house. Mason? Yeah? You're going to be okay. I know you don't believe it yet, but you will. She disappeared into the darkness, and Mason stood there alone, trying to hold on to that fragile thread of hope. Cheb. Friday morning arrived too fast. Mason woke up at 5, showered, and stared at his closet. He didn't have a suit anymore, had sold it a year ago when Sophie needed winter clothes. The best he had was a pair of khakis and a button-down shirt that was wrinkled but clean. He ironed the shirt carefully, put it on, and looked at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back. Too thin, too tired, too worn down by years of survival. But beneath the exhaustion, there was still something there, a stubborn refusal to disappear. Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. You look fancy. Mason smiled. I've got a meeting today, an important one. Are you nervous? Yeah, a little. Sophie walked over and hugged him. You'll do good, Dad. I know you will. Mason held her tight, feeling the weight of everything he was fighting for. At 1 o'clock, Victoria knocked on the door. She was dressed sharp, blazer, heels, hair pulled back. You ready? She asked. No. Good. That means you care. Let's go. They drove downtown in her car, a sleek black sedan that made Mason feel even more out of place. The city rose around them, glass towers and construction cranes, the skyline he used to know by heart. Victoria pulled into a parking garage beneath a modern office building. Nathan's firm is on the 12th floor. You've got your portfolio? Mason held up the worn folder. Yeah. Then let's do this. They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, Mason's stomach twisted. The office was all clean lines and polished floors, the kind of place he used to belong. A receptionist smiled at them. Mr. Reed and Miss Hale? That's us, Victoria said. Mr. Cole is waiting. Follow me. They walked down a hallway lined with architectural renderings and project photos. Mason's hands were sweating. His heart was racing. The receptionist opened a door, and Nathan Cole stood up from behind a desk. He was maybe 50, gray hair, solid build, with the kind of presence that came from years of making decisions that mattered. Mason, Nathan said, extending a hand. Good to meet you. Victoria's told me a lot about your work. Boo! Mason shook his hand, trying to keep his voice steady. Thanks for meeting with me. Have a seat. They sat, and Nathan opened a folder on his desk, Mason's old portfolio, printed and organized. I've looked through your projects, Nathan said. The mixed-use development near the waterfront, the community center in Oak Ridge, the office tower on 3rd Street. Strong work, clean lines, functional design, good use of space. Thank you. Nathan leaned back in his chair. Victoria says you got pushed out of the industry after blowing the whistle on a corrupt contractor. That true? Mason's throat tightened. Yes. Tell me what happened. Mason took a breath and told the story. The housing project, the substandard materials, the falsified reports. Gregory Bell and the decision to stay silent or speak up. The investigation, the media storm, the blacklist. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Mason finished, Nathan nodded slowly. I know Gregory Bell, Nathan said. I know how he operates. And I know he's destroyed careers before. So here's my question. If I hire you and Bell finds out, what's to stop him from coming after this project the same way he came after you? Mason met Nathan's eyes. Nothing. He'll probably try. But the difference is, this time I'm not alone. And this time I know what I'm up against. Nathan studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled out another folder and slid it across the desk. I'm working on a 5-site affordable housing development. Low-income families, single parents, people who need stable housing but can't afford market rates. It's fully funded, city-approved, and ready to go. I need an architect who understands that design isn't just about aesthetics. It's about dignity. I need someone who can create spaces that make people feel human. Can you do that? Yeekies. Mason looked at the folder, his hands trembling. Yes. Then the job's yours. Mason's breath caught. What? I'm offering you a contract. 3-month trial period? Then we'll make it permanent if things work out. Salary's competitive, benefits included, and you'll have full creative control over the design. I want your vision, Mason, not some watered-down version. Can you handle that? Mason felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back. Yes, I can handle that. Nathan smiled. Good. Start Monday. My assistant will send over the contract and the site details. Welcome back to architecture, Mason. They shook hands again, and Mason stood up, legs shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. Victoria walked him back to the elevator, and when the doors closed, Mason leaned against the wall and let out a breath he'd been holding for 3 years. I told you, Victoria said softly. Mason looked at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled, really smiled. Thank you, he said, for everything. Victoria reached out and squeezed his hand. You earned this. Don't forget that. But when they got back to Maple Ridge, Mason walked straight to Sophie's school and picked her up early. What's wrong, Sophie? Sophie asked, eyes wide. Nothing's wrong, Mason said, lifting her into his arms. I got a job, Soph, a real job, doing what I used to do. Sophie's face lit up. You're going to draw buildings again? Yeah, kiddo, I'm going to draw buildings again. She hugged him tight, and Mason carried her to the truck, feeling lighter than he had in years. That night he made dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and sauce from a jar. but it tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. Victoria came over with a bottle of champagne she'd been saving, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table, talking and laughing and planning the future. Sophie fell asleep on the couch, and Mason carried her upstairs. When he came back down, Victoria was washing dishes. "You don't have to do that," Mason said. "I know." They stood there in the kitchen, and Mason felt the weight of the past 3 years start to lift. "I start Monday," Mason said, "and I'm going to make this work. For Sophie, for me, for—" He trailed off, and Victoria looked at him. "For us?" she asked quietly. Mason nodded. "Yeah, for us. Victoria smiled, and in that moment, standing in the dim light of a broken-down kitchen in a run-down house on Maple Ridge, Mason Reed realized something he'd forgotten how to believe, that maybe, just maybe, things could actually get better. Ikas. End of part 2. Monday morning, Mason woke up before his alarm and lay there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. He hadn't felt this kind of nervous energy in years. The good kind. The kind that came from possibility instead of dread. He got up, showered, put on the same khakis and button-down from Friday, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to remember how to be the person he used to be. Sophie knocked on the door. "Dad? You okay in there?" Mason opened it. "Yeah, Soph. Just getting ready." She looked at him seriously. "You're going to do great." "How do you know?" "Because you're good at building things. You always have been." Mason knelt down and hugged her. "When did you get so smart?" "I don't know. I just am." He made her breakfast, walked her to the bus stop, and watched until the yellow bus disappeared around the corner. Then he got in his truck and drove to Nathan Cole's office, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. Nathan's firm occupied the entire 12th floor. The receptionist directed Mason to a conference room where Nathan was waiting with 2 other people, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a younger guy who looked fresh out of grad school. "Mason, this is Laura Chen, my project manager, and David Ortiz, our junior architect," Nathan said. "They'll be working with you on the housing development." Mason shook their hands, trying to read their faces. Laura looked skeptical. David looked curious. "Let's get started," Nathan said, spreading blueprints across the table. 5 sites, all in the South District. Mixed demographics. Working families, single parents, seniors on fixed incomes. Zoning's approved, but the city wants something innovative, something that doesn't look like every other low-income project. Mason studied the site maps. The locations were scattered across neighborhoods that had been neglected for decades. Empty lots surrounded by struggling businesses, cracked sidewalks, buildings with bars on the windows. "What's the budget?" Mason asked. "Tight," Laura said. "We're working with federal grants and private investors who want proof of concept before they commit long-term. You'll have to be creative." Mason nodded, his mind already racing. "What about community input? Have you talked to the people who'll actually live here?" Nathan smiled. "That's why I hired you. Most architects design for the client. I need someone who designs for the residents. You'll have access to demographic data, but I want you to visit the sites, talk to people, understand what they need." "When do I start?" "Right now." Nathan handed him a folder with site addresses, contact information for city officials, and a timeline that made Mason's stomach drop. The first phase had to be designed and approved within 6 weeks. "That's not a lot of time, Mason said. "No," Nathan agreed. "But if anyone can do it, I think you can." Mason took the folder and felt the weight of it settle into his chest. This was real. This was happening. Laura walked him to a desk near the window. His desk, apparently, with a computer, drafting software already installed, and a view of the city skyline he used to know. "Listen," Laura said, lowering her voice. "Nathan believes in second chances, but the rest of us are watching. You screw this up, it doesn't just hurt you, it hurts the whole project. Understand?" Mason met her eyes. "I understand." "Good. Then prove you belong here, sir." She walked away, and Mason sat down at his desk, opened the folder, and got to work. The first site was in a neighborhood called Riverside, though there was no river anymore. Just a dried-up canal and a stretch of abandoned warehouses. Mason parked his truck and walked the perimeter, taking notes, snapping photos with his phone. The lot was bigger than he'd expected, bordered by a liquor store and a laundromat that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. An older woman came out of the laundromat carrying a basket of clothes. She eyed Mason suspiciously. "You a developer?" she asked. "Architect," Mason said. "I'm working on a housing project for this site." "Another one, great. That means rent goes up and people like me get pushed out." "That's not the plan. This is affordable housing for people who already live here." The woman snorted. "That's what they all say. Then the fancy apartments go up, and suddenly we can't afford to stay." Bassists. Shit. Mason didn't have an answer for that. She was right to be suspicious. He'd seen it happen 100 times, developers promising community investment and delivering gentrification. "What's your name?" Mason asked. "Ruth." "Ruth, I'm Mason. I grew up in neighborhoods like this. I know what it's like when people with money show up and pretend they care. I'm not pretending. I'm trying to build something that actually helps." Ruth studied him for a long moment. "You got kids?" "A daughter, 7 years old." "Then you know what it's like to worry about keeping a roof over their head." "Yeah, I do." Ruth shifted her laundry basket. "If you're serious about helping, talk to people. Don't just draw pretty pictures and call it a day. Talk to the people who live here. Find out what they need." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." "That's exactly." Ruth nodded slowly. "All right then. Come by the laundromat tomorrow afternoon. I'll introduce you to some folks. But you better not waste our time." "I won't." She walked away, and Mason stood there in the empty lot, feeling the weight of what he'd just promised. That night, Mason came home to find Victoria sitting on his porch with Sophie, both of them working on a puzzle. "How was the first day?" Victoria asked. Mason sat down on the steps. "Overwhelming, but good." "Did Nathan give you the timeline?" 6 weeks for the first phase. It's insane." "You can handle it." Sophie looked up from the puzzle. "Are you going to build houses for people who don't have homes?" "Something like that," Mason said. "That's nice. Everyone should have a home." "Baham." Mason felt his chest tighten. "Yeah, kiddo, they should." Victoria helped Sophie finish the puzzle, then sent her inside to wash up for dinner. Mason started to follow, but Victoria caught his arm. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. Mason's stomach dropped. "What?" "I made some calls today about Sophie's therapy. There's a clinic downtown that works with low-income families. Sliding scale fees. I set up an appointment for next week." She. Mason's jaw tightened. "Victoria, I told you. I know what you told me. But Sophie needs help, and you need to let someone help you give it to her. This isn't charity, it's logistics. I have connections, I made a phone call, and now your daughter has access to care she needs. That's it." Mason wanted to argue, but he was too tired, and Victoria was right. He couldn't afford to let pride get in the way of Sophie's well-being. "Thank you," he said finally. "You're welcome. Now go inside and have dinner with your daughter. You've got work tomorrow." And sack. The next afternoon, Mason went back to the laundromat in Riverside. Ruth was there, folding towels, and she introduced him to a group of residents who lived in the neighborhood. A single mother with 2 kids, an elderly man on disability, a young couple trying to save up for their first apartment. Mason sat with them for 2 hours, listening. They talked about safety, about needing better lighting and secure locks. They talked about schools and bus routes and grocery stores that were too far away. They talked about wanting spaces where kids could play without parents worrying. They talked about dignity, about living in places that didn't look or feel like warehouses for poor people. Mason took notes on everything. When he got back to his desk that evening, he started sketching. Not the polished, computer-generated renderings architects usually started with, but rough pencil drawings, floor plans that prioritized natural light and ventilation, communal courtyards where neighbors could meet, ground floor spaces that could house a daycare or a community center. Laura walked by and glanced at his work. "Those are preliminary?" "Yeah. They're rough. They're honest." She didn't say anything, just kept walking. But Mason saw her pause at her own desk and look back at his sketches before sitting down. David stopped by later. "You went to the site?" "Yeah. Talked to residents." That's more than most architects do. You really think that'll make a difference? I don't know, but it's worth trying. David nodded. For what it's worth, I think Nathan made the right call hiring you. Thanks. Just don't make the rest of us look bad. What? David grinned and walked away, and Mason went back to his sketches, working late into the night. That 2 weeks into the job, Mason hit his first real obstacle. The city planning department rejected his initial designs. Nathan called him into his office, and Mason's stomach twisted when he saw the stack of red-marked blueprints on the desk. They're saying the building heights violate zoning restrictions, Nathan said, and the courtyard designs don't meet fire code requirements. Mason felt his chest tighten. I checked the codes. These should be compliant. They're interpreting the codes differently. It happens. We just need to revise. That'll push back the timeline. I know, but we don't have a choice. Mason took the blueprints and went back to his desk, frustration burning in his throat. He'd spent 2 weeks on these designs, working late nights, pouring everything he had into creating something that actually worked for the people who'd lived there. And now he had to start over. Victoria found him that evening, still at his desk at 8 o'clock, surrounded by crumpled paper and empty coffee cups. You've been here 12 hours, she said. I know. Go home, Mason. I can't. I've got to fix these designs. You can fix them tomorrow. Sophie's asking for you. Mason looked up, guilt hitting him hard. Is she okay? She's fine, but she misses you. You've been working late every night this week. Mason ran his hands through his hair. I know, there's so much pressure. If I screw this up, you won't screw it up, but you will burn out if you don't take care of yourself. And Sophie needs her dad, not a ghost who comes home too exhausted to talk. Mason knew she was right. He saved his work, grabbed his jacket, and followed Victoria to the elevator. When he got home, Sophie was already in bed. Mason went upstairs and sat on the edge of her mattress. Hey, Soph. She opened her eyes. You're home. Yeah, I'm sorry I've been working so late. It's okay. Victoria said you're doing important stuff. I am, but that doesn't mean you're not important too. You're the most important thing in my life, kiddo. You know that, right? Sophie nodded. I know. Mason kissed her forehead. I'll do better, I promise. Okay. She fell back asleep, and Mason sat there for a long time, watching her breathe, trying to remember how to balance being a father and being an architect when both felt like they required everything he had. The revised designs took another week. Mason worked through the fire code issues, adjusted the building heights, and incorporated feedback from the city planners. When he submitted the new blueprints, he held his breath and waited. The approval came back on a Friday afternoon. Laura walked over to his desk with a rare smile. City signed off. We're moving forward. Mason felt relief flood through him. They didn't find anything else? Nope, you're good. Nathan wants to see you in his office. Mason walked down the hall, heart pounding. Nathan was on the phone when Mason knocked, but he waved him in. Yeah, I understand, Nathan was saying. But we're moving forward regardless. I'll send over the contracts by Monday. He hung up and looked at Mason. Sit down. Mason sat. Everything okay? Nathan leaned back in his chair. Gregory Bell knows you're working for me. Mason's blood went cold. How? Someone at the city planning office, probably. Bell has people everywhere. He called me this morning, said hiring you was a mistake. Said you're unstable, unreliable, a liability. What did you tell him? I told him to go to hell. Nathan's voice was calm, matter of fact. But he's not going to stop there. He's going to try to sabotage this project, and he's going to use you to do it. Mason felt his hand start to shake. If this is going to put your firm at risk, Mason, stop. I knew who you were when I hired you. I knew Bell would come after us, but I also knew your work was worth the fight. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep designing, I'm going to keep building, and Bell can waste his energy trying to tear us down. We've got contracts. We've got city approval, and we've got investors who believe in this project. He can make noise, but he can't stop us. Mason stared at him. Why are you doing this? Because I'm tired of people like Bell winning and because you deserve a chance to finish what you started 3 years ago. Nathan stood up. Now go home. It's Friday. Spend the weekend with your daughter. Monday, we break ground on the first site. Utek. Mason didn't tell Victoria about Belle right away. He wanted to, but part of him was afraid that if he spoke it out loud, the fear would become real. Saturday morning, he took Sophie to the park. They spent hours on the swings and slides, and Mason tried to focus on her laughter instead of the knot in his stomach. Dad, can Victoria come have dinner with us tonight? Sophie asked on the way home. You really like her, huh? Yeah, she's nice, and she makes you smile. Mason glanced at Sophie in the rearview mirror. I smile. Not like you do when she's around. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. That evening, Victoria came over. Mason made spaghetti again. It was pretty much the only thing he knew how to cook well, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table. Nathan told me about Belle, Victoria said after Sophie went upstairs. Mason's jaw tightened. Of course he did. He also told me you handled it well, that you didn't panic. I'm panicking now. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. Belle's going to try to destroy this. You know that, right? Yeah. So what are you going to do? Mason looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. I'm going to finish the project. I'm going to build something that proves he was wrong. And I'm not going to let him take this away from me again. Boo! What? Victoria smiled. Good. Because I'm not letting him win either. Victoria, this isn't your fight. Yes, it is. I'm invested in this project too. Not just financially, personally. You, Sophie, this neighborhood, you're all part of my life now. And I don't walk away when things get hard. Mason felt his throat tighten. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Let someone care about me. Trust that they'll stay. Victoria squeezed his hand. You don't have to know how. You just have to let it happen. They sat there in the quiet kitchen, hands linked, and for the first time in years, Mason felt like maybe he wasn't carrying everything alone. Monday morning, Mason stood at the Riverside site with Nathan, Laura, David, and a construction crew. The groundbreaking ceremony was small, just a few city officials, some local residents, and a photographer from the neighborhood paper. Ruth from the laundromat was there, arms crossed, watching. Nathan gave a short speech about community investment and affordable housing. Mason stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, trying not to think about everything that could still go wrong. When it was over, Nathan handed Mason a shovel. You want to do the honors? Mason took the shovel, walked to the center of the lot, and drove it into the dirt. The ground was hard, resistant, but he pushed through. When he pulled the shovel back up, the crowd applauded. Ruth walked over. You better make this good. I will. I'm holding you to that. She walked away, and Mason stood there with the shovel in his hands, looking at the empty lot that would soon be filled with buildings he'd designed. Laura came up beside him. You did good work. Reed, don't screw it up now. I won't. She nodded and walked back to her car. David lingered. For what it's worth, David said, I think this is going to be something special. Thanks. But Laura's right. Belle's going to come after this hard. You ready for that? Mason looked at the construction crew starting to set up equipment. I don't have a choice. The first real attack came 2 weeks later. An article appeared in the city's business journal, an op-ed written by someone Mason didn't recognize, but the fingerprints were all over it. The piece questioned Nathan Cole's judgment, cited Mason's history, and suggested the housing project was doomed to fail because of poor leadership and questionable ethics. Mason read it at his desk, hands shaking. Laura stormed over. Have you seen this? Yeah, it's Belle. He's feeding stories to journalists. I know. Nathan called an emergency meeting. The entire team gathered in the conference room, and Nathan stood at the head of the table, calm and collected. This is going to get worse before it gets better, Nathan said. Belle's playing dirty, and he's got resources. But we're not backing down. The project's on schedule, the designs are solid, and we've got support from the community. That's what matters. Just what, boys, by his sides. What if investors pull out? Laura asked. Then we find new investors, but I don't think they will. Bell can write all the op-eds he wants. It doesn't change the fact that we're building something people need. Step back. You're not stepping back, Nathan said firmly. You're the architect. Your name's on these designs. And if Bell wants a fight, we'll give him one. But we do it by finishing the project, not by running scared. The meeting ended and Mason went back to his desk, chest tight, trying to focus on work. Victoria called him that afternoon. I saw the article. Yeah. How are you holding up? I don't know. I feel like I'm dragging everyone down with me. You're not. Nathan knew what he was getting into. So did I. And we're still here. For how long? Victoria's voice softened. As long as it takes. Mason closed his eyes. I'm scared, Victoria. I'm scared I'm going to lose everything again. Shit. You're not going to lose everything. You've got Sophie, you've got Nathan, you've got me, and you've got work that matters. That's more than most people have. It doesn't feel like enough. It is. I promise you, it is. Mason didn't know if he believed her, but he wanted to. He hung up, stared at the blueprints on his screen, and forced himself to keep working. That weekend, Sophie's first therapy appointment arrived. Mason drove her downtown to the clinic Victoria had found, a small office in a building that had seen better days, but the waiting room was clean and the receptionist smiled when they walked in. Sophie sat next to Mason, swinging her legs, nervous. What if I don't like it? She asked. Then we'll figure something else out. But you have to try first. It was shade. A woman in her 30s came out. Dr. Park. Warm eyes, calm voice. She knelt down to Sophie's level. Hi, Sophie. I'm Dr. Park. You want to come hang out with me for a little bit? Sophie looked at Mason. He nodded. Okay, Sophie said quietly. They disappeared into an office and Mason sat in the waiting room, staring at his phone, checking email, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. 40 minutes later, Sophie came back out. She looked tired, but okay. How was it? Mason asked. It was fine. We just talked. About what? Stuff. She's nice. Mason looked at Dr. Park, who gave him a reassuring nod. Sophie did great, Dr. Park said. I'd like to see her again next week, if that's all right. Yeah, that's fine. They scheduled another appointment, and Mason drove Sophie home. She was quiet in the car, staring out the window. You okay, Soph? Yeah, I think so. Did it help? Sophie thought about it. Maybe. Yet. Mason reached over and squeezed her hand. That's okay. We'll keep trying. 3 weeks later, construction on the Riverside site was in full swing. Foundations were poured, framing was going up, and Mason visited the site every other day to check progress. He was standing in what would eventually be the central courtyard when his phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mason Reed? A man's voice, smooth and cold. Yeah, who's this? Gregory Bell. I think it's time we had a conversation. Mason's blood went cold. I've got nothing to say to you. That's unfortunate, because I've got plenty to say to you. You cost me millions 3 years ago, and now you're trying to rebuild your career on the back of Nathan Cole's reputation. That's not going to work. I'm doing my job, that's all. Your job is a joke. You're a failed architect playing hero, and when this project collapses, everyone's going to remember why you got blacklisted in the first place. Mason's hand shook. You're the one who cut corners. You're the one who put families at risk. I just told the truth. Your truth ruined lives, Mason, and it's going to ruin more if you don't walk away now. I'm not walking away. Bell laughed. Then you're a fool. But I'll give you credit. You're a persistent fool. I'll see you at the city council meeting next month. Let's see if your designs hold up under scrutiny. The line went dead. Mason stood there in the half-built courtyard, phone in hand, feeling the weight of Bell's threat settle over him like a shadow. Nathan found him an hour later, still standing there. You all right? Nathan asked. Bell called me. What did he say? That he's coming after the project at the city council meeting, that he's going to tear it apart. Nathan's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. How? By finishing the designs, by showing the city council exactly what we're building, and by proving that Bell's full of it. You're a good architect, Mason. Your work speaks for itself. Let it. Mason wanted to believe him, but standing there in the skeleton of a building that might never get finished, it was hard to hold on to hope. That night, he told Victoria everything. They sat on her porch, the neighborhood dark and quiet around them. He's going to destroy this, Mason said, just like he destroyed everything else. Not if we stop him first. How? Victoria turned to face him. By making sure your designs are so good, so undeniable, that the city council has no choice but to approve them. Bell can talk all he wants, but if the work is solid, he can't touch you. And if it's not enough, then we fight harder. But you don't give up, Mason. Not now. Mason looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Okay, he said. We fight. Victoria smiled. Good, because I'm not letting you quit. The weeks leading up to the city council meeting were brutal. Mason worked 14-hour days, refining every detail of the designs, running structural calculations until his eyes blurred, making sure there wasn't a single weak point Belle could exploit. He barely saw Sophie except for brief mornings before she left for school and late nights when he'd come home and find her already asleep. Victoria tried to help. She'd show up at his office with dinner, force him to take breaks, remind him that burning himself out wouldn't help anyone. But Mason couldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Belle's face, heard that cold voice promising to destroy everything Mason had built. Laura noticed. She cornered him one afternoon in the break room. You look like hell, she said. Thanks. I'm serious, Reed. When's the last time you slept? Mom. Mason poured himself another coffee. I'll sleep after the meeting. You're going to collapse before then. I'm fine. Laura crossed her arms. Look, I didn't trust you when you started. I thought Nathan was making a mistake. But your work's solid, better than solid, so stop acting like you've got something to prove, and start acting like someone who knows what he's doing. Mason stared at her. Belle's gonna tear this apart. You know that. Maybe. But if you walk into that council meeting looking defeated, you've already lost. Belle wants you scared. Don't give him what he wants. She left, and Mason stood there holding his coffee, trying to absorb what she'd said. That night he came home to find Sophie sitting on the porch steps, drawing in her notebook. She looked up when he got out of the truck. You're home early, she said. It was 8 o'clock. Yeah, I thought maybe we could have dinner together. Oh, woke up. Sophie's face lit up. Really? Really? What do you want? Can we get pizza? Mason smiled. Yeah, kiddo, we can get pizza. They ordered from the place down the street and ate on the living room floor because the kitchen table was covered in blueprints. Sophie told him about school, about a girl named Emma who'd invited her to sit at lunch, about a book she was reading where a kid solved mysteries. That sounds cool, Mason said. You like mysteries? I like figuring things out, like you do with buildings. Mason felt his chest tighten. You think that's what I do? Yeah, you look at empty spaces and figure out what should go there. That's kind of like solving a mystery. Mason had never thought about it that way, but she was right. Architecture was problem solving, taking constraints and turning them into something functional and beautiful. You're pretty smart, you know that? Mason said. Sophie grinned. I know. After she went to bed, Victoria knocked on the door. Mason let her in, and she immediately saw the blueprints covering every surface. You're still working, she said. Just reviewing. Mason, you need to rest. I can't. The meeting's in 2 weeks. If there's anything wrong, say this. Victoria took his hands and made him look at her. There's nothing wrong. The designs are perfect. You've checked them 100 times. What you need now is to take care of yourself so you can walk into that meeting with your head up. I don't know if I can do that. Yes, you can, because you're not the same person who got destroyed 3 years ago. You're stronger now. You've survived things that would have broken most people, and you're not alone anymore. Mason felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. What if I fail? What if Belle wins and Sophie has to watch me lose everything again? Then we'll deal with it, together. But you're not going to fail. I won't let you. Victoria pulled him into a hug, and Mason held on to her, letting himself believe just for a moment that maybe things could actually work out. But sets. 10 days before the meeting, another article appeared. This one was worse. It didn't just question Mason's competence, it dredged up every detail of the scandal 3 years ago, painting him as a troublemaker who'd cost the city millions in lost housing investments. The piece included quotes from unnamed sources claiming Nathan's firm was struggling financially and had hired Mason out of desperation. Mason read it in his truck before work, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone. When he walked into the office, the whole team was already gathered in the conference room. Nathan stood at the head of the table, jaw tight. "I'm guessing everyone's seen the article," Nathan said. Nods around the room. "It's garbage," Laura said. "Half of it's speculation, the other half's outright lies." "Doesn't matter if it's lies," David said quietly. "People will believe it." "Then we make sure the truth is louder," Nathan said. He looked at Mason. "You okay?" Mason's throat was tight. "I'm fine. You're not. But you will be. We're going to finish this project. We're going to present it to the city council. And we're going to show everyone that Belle's full of it. Understood?" Everyone nodded. "Good. Now get back to work. We've got 10 days. The meeting broke up and Mason went to his desk, trying to focus. But his phone kept buzzing. Messages from people he hadn't talked to in years, some supportive, most just curious about the drama. He turned off his phone and buried himself in work. At lunch, David sat down next to him. "My girlfriend saw the article. Asked if I was working with that guy who sabotaged the affordable housing project." Mason's stomach dropped. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her she was reading propaganda, that you're one of the best architects I've ever worked with, that Belle's a liar and the media's eating it up because it makes a good story." Mason looked at him. "You believe that?" "Yeah, I do. Your designs are solid, Mason. Anyone with eyes can see that. Belle's just loud." "Loud wins sometimes." "Not this time." David went back to his desk, and Mason sat there, trying to hold on to that faith. That weekend, Mason took Sophie to her therapy appointment. Dr. Park called him in after the session. "How's Sophie doing at home?" Dr. Park asked. "Better, I think. She's talking more. Seems less anxious." "That's good." "She's been opening up in our sessions, talking about her fears, her memories of moving around, her worries about stability." Mason's chest tightened. "Is she okay?" "She's processing a lot, but she's resilient. Kids are more adaptable than we give them credit for. The important thing is that she feels safe, that she knows you're not going anywhere." "I'm trying." "I know. And it's working. She talks about you a lot, about how hard you work, how much you care. She's proud of you." Mason felt tears burning behind his eyes. "I just want to give her a normal life." Normal is overrated. What Sophie needs is stability, love, and a parent who shows up. You're doing all of that. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. When he walked back to the waiting room, Sophie was drawing in her notebook. She looked up and smiled. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked. "Yeah, kiddo, we can get ice cream." They went to a shop near the clinic, and Sophie ordered chocolate while Mason got vanilla. They sat outside on a bench watching people walk by. "Dad?" Sophie said. "Yeah? Are you scared about your meeting?" Mason hesitated. "Yeah, a little." "Why?" "Because there's a man who doesn't like me. He's going to try to make people think I'm not good at my job." "But you are good at your job." "I know, but sometimes people believe the loud person, even when the quiet person is telling the truth." Sophie thought about that. "That's not fair." "No, it's not." "Then you have to be louder." Mason smiled. "Maybe you're right." "I am. You're good at building things. You just have to make sure everyone knows it." Mason hugged her, feeling the weight of her trust settle into his chest. Shake. The night before the city council meeting, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through his presentation over and over in his mind. Nathan had told him to expect tough questions. Laura had warned him Belle would be there, probably with a team of lawyers and consultants ready to pick apart every detail. At 2 in the morning, Mason gave up on sleep and went downstairs. He made coffee and spread his notes across the kitchen table one more time. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Victoria standing there in sweatpants and a jacket. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "No." She came inside and sat down at the table. "You ready?" "I don't know. What if I freeze up? What if I can't answer their questions?" "Then you take a breath and answer them anyway. You know this project inside and out, Mason. You've lived it for months. No one knows it better than you." "Bell's going to make me look incompetent." Only if you let him. You're not incompetent. You're brilliant, and tomorrow you're going to prove it." Mason looked at her. "Why do you believe in me so much?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Because I know what it's like to have people underestimate you. When my ex-husband left, people acted like I was broken, like I'd never recover. I spent 2 years proving them wrong, building a life, making money, becoming someone who didn't need anyone. But you know what? I was lonely and angry and scared that if I let anyone close again, they'd destroy me the same way he did. What changed? You did. Watching you fight for Sophie, watching you refuse to give up even when everything was stacked against you. It reminded me that strength isn't about being invulnerable. It's about getting back up. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help you the way I wish someone had helped me." Mason felt his throat tighten. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have survived. You always do. But I'm glad I could make it easier." They sat there in the quiet kitchen, and Mason felt something shift, something that had been building for months, something he'd been too scared to acknowledge. "Victoria, don't," she said softly. "Not tonight. Tonight you need to focus. Tomorrow you're going to walk into that meeting and show them what you're made of. And then, after it's over, we'll figure out the rest." Mason nodded, and Victoria stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back. "You're going to win, Mason. I know you are." Then she was gone, and Mason was alone with his notes and his fear and a fragile, desperate hope that maybe she was right. The city council chamber was packed. Mason arrived 30 minutes early with Nathan, Laura, and David, and already the seats were filling up. Residents from the neighborhoods where the housing would be built, journalists with cameras, city officials in suits, and in the back row, Gregory Bell. Bell looked exactly like Mason remembered. Tall, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from never losing. He was talking to a man in a dark jacket, laughing about something, completely at ease. Mason's stomach twisted. "Don't look at him," Nathan said quietly. "Look at the council. They're the ones who matter." Mason forced himself to turn away and focus on setting up the presentation. Laura helped him connect the laptop to the projector while David organized the printed handouts. The blueprints were displayed on boards behind them, detailed renderings of the 5 housing sites. At exactly 10 o'clock, the council president called the meeting to order. There were other items on the agenda: zoning changes, budget approvals, and Mason had to sit through 45 minutes of bureaucratic discussion before they finally reached his project. "Next item," the council president said. "Proposal for affordable housing development, South District, 5 sites." Nathan Cole presenting. Nathan stood up, calm and professional. He gave a brief overview of the project, the need for affordable housing, the community input that had shaped the designs, the timeline, and budget. Then he turned it over to Mason. Mason stood up, legs shaking, and walked to the front of the room. Every eye was on him. He could feel Bell's gaze like a weight on his shoulders. "Good morning," Mason said, his voice steadier than he felt. "My name is Mason Reed, and I'm the lead architect on this project. What you're looking at are designs for 5 residential developments that will provide housing for over 300 families currently living in unstable or unsafe conditions." He clicked to the first slide, the Riverside site. This is the first location, mixed-use building with 60 units, ground floor community space, and a central courtyard designed to encourage social interaction. Every unit has access to natural light, proper ventilation, and secure entry. We've incorporated feedback from residents who will actually live here. Single parents who need childcare options, seniors who need accessible design, families who need safe outdoor spaces for their kids. Mason walked the council through each site, explaining the design choices, the cost breakdowns, the sustainability features. He spoke clearly, confidently, pouring everything he'd learned and fought for into every word. When he finished, the council president nodded. Thank you, Mr. Reed. We'll now open the floor for questions. A council member in her 50s raised her hand. These designs are impressive, but I'm concerned about the budget. Can you guarantee these projects won't exceed cost projections? We've built contingencies into the budget, Nathan said, and we're working with contractors who have strong track records on similar projects. We're confident we can deliver on time and on budget. Another council member spoke up. What about maintenance? Who's responsible for upkeep once these buildings are occupied? Mason answered. We've partnered with a property management company that specializes in affordable housing. They'll handle maintenance, tenant relations, and emergency repairs. It's all outlined in the proposal. The questions continued for 20 minutes. Tough, detailed, but fair. Mason answered each one, feeling his confidence grow. Then Gregory Bell stood up. I'd like to address the council, Bell said. The council president hesitated. This is a public comment period for approved speakers. I'm an investor in this city's real estate market, and I have concerns about this project. The council president sighed. You have 3 minutes. Bell walked to the front of the room, every movement calculated and smooth. He smiled at the council, then turned to look at Mason. I want to start by saying I appreciate the effort that's gone into these designs, but I have serious concerns about the architect's qualifications. Mason Reed was involved in a major housing scandal 3 years ago. A project he worked on was shut down due to structural violations, costing the city millions in lost investments and leaving low-income families without housing. Mason's chest tightened. Now, Mr. Reed would have you believe he was a whistleblower, but the truth is more complicated. He made unsubstantiated claims, bypassed proper channels, and created a media circus that destroyed a legitimate project. And now he's back, working on another affordable housing initiative. I have to ask, can we trust him not to make the same mistakes? Bell paused, letting the words sink in. The room was silent. I'm not saying Mr. Reed is a bad person, but his judgment is questionable. And when we're talking about housing for vulnerable families, we can't afford to take risks on architects with problematic histories. Bell sat down, and Mason felt the blood drain from his face. The council members were whispering to each other. Journalists were scribbling notes. Nathan stood up. Mr. Bell's characterization is inaccurate. Mason Reed exposed genuine safety violations. The investigation confirmed his findings. He was blacklisted not because he was wrong, but because he told the truth. That's one version of the story, Bell said smoothly, but it's not the version the courts found. No charges were ever filed against the contractor. The project was shut down due to regulatory issues, not safety concerns. That's a lie, Mason said, his voice shaking. The council president banged her gavel. Mr. Reed, please. It's a lie, Mason repeated, louder now. The contractor was using substandard materials. I documented everything. The investigation proved it. Bell killed the project to protect his investment, and he destroyed my career to keep me quiet. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Council members argued. Bell sat there with a small, satisfied smile. Nathan grabbed Mason's arm. Let me handle this. But Mason pulled away. He walked to the front of the room, hands trembling, and faced the council. 3 years ago, I reported safety violations because I believed families deserved to live in buildings that wouldn't collapse. I lost my job, my reputation, and my career because I refused to stay silent. Gregory Bell wants you to believe I'm unstable, that I can't be trusted. But the truth is he's scared. He's scared because these designs are good. They're honest. They prioritize people over profit. And he knows that if this project succeeds, it proves that affordable housing doesn't have to be cheap and dangerous. It can be dignified. Mason looked at the council members, then at the residents sitting in the audience. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm perfect. I'm asking you to trust the work. Look at the designs. Look at the budgets. Look at the community input. This project isn't about me. It's about 300 families who need stable housing, and they deserve better than to be used as pawns in Gregory Bell's personal vendetta. The room was silent. The council president looked at Bell, then at Mason. Thank you, Mr. Reed. We'll take this under advisement and vote next week. Wait! A voice called from the audience. Ruth from the laundromat stood up. I live in Riverside. I've talked to Mr. Reed. I've seen his plans, and I can tell you he cares about this project. He listened to us. He asked what we needed. That's more than any other developer has ever done. Another resident stood. I'm a single mother. I need affordable housing that's safe for my kids. These designs give us that. I don't care about what happened 3 years ago. I care about what's happening now. One by one, residents stood up, voicing their support. The journalists stopped shouting. The council members listened. Belle's face tightened. The council president banged her gavel. We'll vote next week. Meeting adjourned. Outside the chamber, Mason leaned against the wall, shaking. Nathan and Laura were talking to reporters. David was packing up the presentation materials. Victoria appeared out of nowhere and pulled Mason into a hug. You did it, she whispered. You stood up to him. I don't know if it was enough. It was. I saw their faces. They believed you. Mason wanted to believe her. But Belle's words were still echoing in his head, and the fear that he'd just destroyed everything was overwhelming. That night back at home, Sophie was waiting on the porch. How'd it go? She asked. Mason sat down next to her. I don't know yet. We'll find out next week. Did you tell them the truth? Yeah, I did. Then you'll win. The truth always wins. Mason wished he had her certainty, but all he could do was hold her hand and hope she was right. The week waiting for the vote was the longest of Mason's life. He went to work, reviewed construction progress, finalized details on the other sites, but his mind was always on the council's decision. Nathan tried to reassure him. The residents' testimony was powerful. That's what matters. Laura was less optimistic. Belle has influence. Don't get your hopes up too high. Victoria refused to let him spiral. She came over every night, made him eat, made him talk about anything other than the vote. On Thursday, Mason's phone rang. Nathan's name on the screen. They voted, Nathan said. Mason's heart stopped. And? We won. 4-3. The project's approved. Mason couldn't breathe. We won? We won. Belle lost. You did it, Mason. Mason hung up and stood there in the middle of his office, tears streaming down his face. David saw him and grinned. We got it? Mason nodded, unable to speak. The whole office erupted in cheers. Laura actually smiled. Nathan walked over and shook Mason's hand. I told you, Nathan said. Your work speaks for itself. That night, Mason drove home and found Sophie and Victoria waiting for him. He got out of the truck and Sophie ran to him. Did you win? Yeah, kiddo, we won. Sophie hugged him and Victoria walked over, eyes bright. I knew you would, she said. Mason pulled her into the hug, and the three of them stood there in the driveway, holding on to each other as the sun set over Maple Ridge. For the first time in 3 years, Mason felt like he could breathe. The victory should have felt bigger. Mason thought winning the vote would erase 3 years of shame, would make him feel whole again. But the morning after the council's decision, he woke up in the same rundown house on Maple Ridge, with the same cracked ceiling and the same weight in his chest. The difference was smaller than he'd imagined, just a quiet sense that maybe, finally, he could stop running. Construction moved forward. The Riverside site progressed from framing to walls, from walls to windows. Mason visited every week, walking through spaces that were starting to look like the sketches he'd drawn months ago. Residents stopped by to watch the progress, and Ruth brought him coffee one afternoon, standing in what would eventually be the central courtyard. You actually did it, she said, looking around at the half-finished building. We're not done yet. No, but you're close, and it looks good. Looks like something people would actually want to live in. Mason smiled. That was the idea. Ruth studied him. You know, when you first showed up here, I thought you were just another guy with a clipboard who'd disappear once the photo op was over. But you stuck around. That means something. Mom, I had a lot of reasons to stick around. Yeah, I heard about what that Bell guy tried to do. You stood up to him. That takes guts. Mason shrugged. I didn't have much choice. We always have a choice. You could have walked away, taken the easy road. But you didn't. That's why people trust you. She left, and Mason stood there in the skeleton of the building, feeling the weight of that trust settle over him. It was heavier than he'd expected, more fragile. At the office, Nathan called him in for a meeting. Laura and David were already there. "We've had interest from other cities," Nathan said. "Word's getting out about the project. 3 different municipalities have reached out asking if we'd be willing to replicate the model." Mason's stomach tightened. "That's a lot of work." "It is, but it's also proof that what we're doing matters. I'm not saying we take on everything, but we should start thinking bigger." Laura looked at Mason. "You up for that?" Mason thought about it. 6 months ago, he would have said no, would have been too scared to believe he deserved more than survival. But now, sitting in this office with people who believed in his work, he realized something had shifted. "Yeah," Mason said. "I'm up for it." Nathan smiled. "Good, because I'm making your position permanent. Full benefits, salary increase, and creative control over any housing projects we take on. You've earned it." Mason felt his throat tighten. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing." When Mason got home that night, he found Victoria and Sophie in his backyard. Victoria had brought over paint samples, and Sophie was helping her hold them up against the house's peeling exterior. "What are you doing?" Mason asked. "Picking colors," Sophie said. "Victoria says we should paint the house." "I didn't say we should. I said we could, if your dad wants to." Mason looked at the paint samples, soft blues, warm grays, colors that would make the house look less like a place people survived in and more like a place people lived. "I can't afford to repaint right now," Mason said. "I'll cover it," Victoria said. "Consider it an investment in the neighborhood." "Victoria, Mason, let me do this, please. You've spent 3 years barely surviving. Let someone help you live a little." Mason looked at Sophie, who was holding up a light blue sample with hopeful eyes. "Okay," Mason said, "let's paint the house." They spent the next 2 weekends working on it. Nathan lent them some equipment, David showed up with paintbrushes, and even Laura stopped by one Saturday with takeout and ended up rolling paint onto the side wall. The neighbors watched at first, curious, and then some started helping, carrying ladders, taping windows, offering cold drinks on hot afternoons. By the end of the second weekend, the house looked transformed. The porch was repaired, the paint was fresh, and the yard had been cleared of weeds. Mason stood in the driveway, exhausted and covered in paint splatters, and realized the house didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like home. Sophie ran up to him, grinning. "It looks so good, Dad." "Yeah, kiddo, it really does." Victoria walked over, wiping paint off her hands. "You did good." "We did good," Mason corrected. She smiled, and Mason felt that pull again, the one he'd been ignoring for months because he was too scared to mess up the one good thing in his life. But standing here, looking at Victoria covered in paint and smiling like she belonged here, Mason realized he was tired of being scared. "Victoria," he started. "Not yet," she said softly. "Soon, but not yet." Sophie's progress in therapy was slow but steady. Dr. Park said she was opening up more, talking about her fears without shutting down. Mason noticed it too. Sophie laughed more, asked more questions, seemed less like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table when she looked up at Mason. "Dad, do you think we'll stay here forever?" Mason paused. "I don't know about forever, but we'll stay as long as we want to. This is our home now. What if something bad happens again?" "Like what?" "Like losing your job, or having to move." Mason set down the dish he was washing and sat across from her. "Bad things might happen. I can't promise they won't, but I can promise that if they do, we'll handle them together. And we've got people now, Victoria, Nathan, Dr. Park. We're not alone anymore." Sophie thought about that. "I like not being alone." "Me too, kiddo." She went back to her homework, and Mason sat there feeling the truth of what he'd just said. For 3 years, he'd believed that depending on anyone was dangerous, that letting people close just gave them the power to hurt him. But isolation hadn't protected him. It had just made everything harder. The real strength, he was starting to understand, was in letting people see you broken and trusting they'd stay anyway. In November, the first families started moving into the Riverside building. Mason was there on move-in day, helping carry boxes, answering questions about the heating system and the laundry room. One of the families was a single mother with 2 young kids, the same woman he'd met months ago during his initial site visit. She walked into her apartment, looked around at the bright kitchen and the windows that let in afternoon light, and started crying. "You okay?" Mason asked. "Yeah," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's just, I've never lived anywhere this nice. I didn't think places like this existed for people like me." Mason felt his chest tighten. "You deserve this. You and your kids. Thank you for building it." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and helped her carry in the rest of her boxes. That night, he told Victoria about it. They were sitting on his porch, watching the first snow of the season fall in soft, lazy flakes. "She thanked me," Mason said, "like I'd done something extraordinary, but all I did was design a building." "You did more than that," Victoria said. "You created a space where she feels safe, where she can build a life. That's not small, Mason. It still feels like it should have been the bare minimum. Like everyone should have access to housing that doesn't make them feel like they're less than human." You're right, they should, but they don't. And you're changing that one building at a time. That matters. Mason looked at her. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You were just too stubborn to notice." Mason laughed, and Victoria leaned against his shoulder. They sat there in the quiet cold, and Mason felt something settle inside him, a sense of peace he hadn't known he'd been searching for. December brought the completion of 2 more sites. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Articles praising the design, interviews with residents who talked about how the buildings had changed their lives. Nathan's firm started getting calls from developers across the state, and Mason's name was showing up in architecture journals again, this time without the shadow of scandal. Gregory Bell stayed quiet. Mason saw his name in a business journal once, something about a failed real estate deal, but Bell didn't reach out, didn't make any more threats. It was like he'd moved on to easier targets. Mason should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt unsettled, like there was still something unresolved. Victoria noticed. "You're thinking about Bell. How do you know?" "Because you get this look, like you're waiting for something bad to happen. So, I guess I'm not used to things going well." "Then get used to it. You earned this, Mason. Stop waiting for someone to take it away." But the feeling didn't go away. Not until one afternoon in mid-December when Mason got a call from an unknown number. "Mason Reed?" A woman's voice. "Yeah? Whoa." "My name is Jennifer Calloway. I'm a reporter with the National Architecture Review. I'm writing a piece on affordable housing design, and your work with Nathan Cole's firm has been getting a lot of attention. I'd like to interview you." Mason's first instinct was to say no. He didn't trust reporters, didn't trust anyone who wanted to tell his story. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Mason said. "I understand your hesitation, but this isn't a hit piece. I'm interested in the work itself, how you approach the design, what you learned from the residents, what makes your projects different. I think people need to hear that story." Mason thought about Ruth, about the single mother who'd cried in her new apartment, about all the families who'd moved into buildings he'd designed. Their stories mattered more than his fear. "Okay," Mason said. "Let's do the interview." They met at a coffee shop downtown. Jennifer was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s, with a recorder and a notebook full of questions. She asked about the design process, about the community input, about the challenges of working within tight budgets. She asked about Gregory Bell, and Mason told the truth, all of it, without bitterness or anger, just facts. "Why did you come back to architecture, Jennifer?" Jennifer asked. "After everything that happened, you could have walked away for good. What made you try again?" Mason thought about that. "I had a daughter who needed a stable life, and I realized that hiding from what I was good at wasn't protecting either of us. It was just making us smaller, so I stopped hiding. And now I'm building things that matter, and I'm not alone anymore. That makes all the difference." The article came out 2 weeks later. It was fair, thoughtful, and focused on the work rather than the scandal. Mason's phone started ringing with calls from other architects. from developers who wanted to collaborate, from cities that needed affordable housing solutions. Nathan walked into Mason's office with a printout of the article. "You're officially back, Reed. How's it feel?" Mason looked at the article, at the photo of him standing in front of the Riverside building, and realized something that had been true for months, but he'd been too scared to acknowledge. "It feels right," Mason said. "But..." Christmas came, and Mason didn't have much money for presents. But Sophie didn't seem to care. She was more excited about decorating the house with lights Victoria had bought, about making cookies with frosting that got everywhere, about the small tree they'd set up in the living room. On Christmas Eve, Victoria came over for dinner. Mason cooked. Nothing fancy, just roast chicken and potatoes, but it felt special because it was the three of them, together, like a family. After Sophie went to bed, Mason and Victoria sat by the tree, drinking wine and watching the lights blink. "This is nice," Victoria said. "Yeah, it is. I never thought I'd have this again. After my divorce, I convinced myself I didn't need anyone. That being alone was safer." "What changed?" Victoria looked at him. "You did. Watching you fight for Sophie, watching you rebuild your life even when it seemed impossible, it reminded me that being alone isn't the same as being safe. It's just lonely." Mason set down his wine glass. "I spent 3 years thinking I didn't deserve this, that if I let myself be happy, it would just get taken away again. Do you still think that?" "Sometimes, but I'm trying not to." "Sit." Victoria reached over and took his hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Mason. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'm here and I'm staying." Mason felt tears burning behind his eyes. "I don't know how to do this, how to let someone in." "You're already doing it. You've been doing it for months. You just didn't realize it." Mason looked at her, this woman who'd shown up in his life when he'd needed someone most, who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, who'd made his broken house feel like a home. "I love you," Mason said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Victoria smiled, tears in her own eyes. "I love you too." They kissed, tentative and careful, and then Mason pulled her close and held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had spent years trying to knock him down. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. Mason, Victoria, and Sophie drove downtown to watch the fireworks. The city was crowded, full of people bundled in coats and scarves, waiting for midnight. Sophie sat on Mason's shoulders, pointing at the buildings lit up against the night sky. "Which ones did you design, Dad?" "None of these, but see that one over there?" Mason pointed to a building in the distance. "That's one I worked on before you were born. It's pretty." "Thanks, kiddo." Victoria stood close, her hand in Mason's free one. When the countdown started, the crowd erupted in noise, people shouting numbers, laughing, celebrating the end of one year and the start of another. At midnight, fireworks exploded overhead. Sophie squealed with delight, and Mason lifted her higher so she could see better. The sky filled with color, gold and silver and blue, bursts of light that reflected off the snow-covered streets. Mason looked at Victoria, and she was already looking at him, smiling. "Happy New Year," she said. "Happy New Year." They kissed again, and Sophie cheered. And for the first time in longer than Mason could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. January brought more work. The final 2 housing sites were in progress, and Nathan's firm had signed contracts for 3 new projects in neighboring cities. Mason was busier than he'd ever been, but the work didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt purposeful. Sophie started thriving at school. She made friends, joined an after-school art club, started bringing home drawings that Mrs. Alvarez praised in notes to Mason. Dr. Park said Sophie's anxiety had decreased significantly, that she was showing signs of real resilience. Victoria became a permanent fixture in their lives. She had dinner with them most nights, helped Sophie with homework, showed up at Mason's office with coffee when he worked late. They didn't talk about the future in concrete terms, didn't make grand plans or promises, but Mason could feel it building, solid and real. One Saturday in February, Mason took Sophie and Victoria to the Riverside site. The building was fully complete now, all 5 floors occupied. The courtyard filled with kids playing and parents talking. Ruth was there, sitting on a bench in the winter sun. She waved when she saw Mason. "Brought the family, huh?" Ruth said. Mason glanced at Victoria and Sophie. Yeah, I guess I did. Good. They should see what you built. All of you. Gemacht. Sophie ran off to look at the playground equipment in the courtyard, and Victoria sat down next to Ruth. Mason stood there, looking at the building, at the windows reflecting sunlight, at the front entrance with its secure doors and accessible ramp, at the families moving in and out like this place had always belonged to them. You did good, Mason, Ruth said. Real good. Mason felt his throat tighten. Thanks. Now don't go getting emotional on me. You've got more work to do. Those other sites aren't going to build themselves. Mason laughed. No, they're not. He sat down next to Victoria, and she leaned against him, and Sophie came running back to show them a butterfly she'd found, even though it was February and butterflies shouldn't be out yet. Mason realized something sitting there, something he'd been too broken to understand 3 years ago when everything fell apart. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't 4 walls or a roof or a piece of land. Home was the people who stayed when things got hard. Home was Sophie's laugh, and Victoria's hand in his, and Ruth's gruff approval. Home was knowing that even when life knocked you down, there were people who'd help you stand back up. He'd spent years believing he had to do everything alone, that asking for help was weakness, that survival meant keeping everyone at arm's length. But he'd been wrong. Survival wasn't strength. It was just survival. Living, really living, required something harder. It required letting people see you at your worst and trusting they'd still be there at your best. It required building something bigger than yourself and believing it mattered, even when the world told you it didn't. Mason looked at Victoria, at Sophie, at the building full of families who had homes because he'd refused to give up. What are you thinking about? Victoria asked. Mason smiled. Just that I'm glad I'm here. Me too. Sophie climbed onto Mason's lap. Dad, can we get pizza for dinner? Yeah, kiddo, we can get pizza. And can Victoria come? Victoria always comes. Sophie grinned and Mason held her close, breathing in the cold February air and feeling, for the first time in his entire adult life, like everything was going to be okay. Not perfect, not easy, but okay. And sometimes okay was more than enough. Spring came to Maple Ridge slowly. The trees along the street started budding, the grass turned green, and Mason finally finished the last of the 5 housing sites. The completion ceremony was small, just a ribbon cutting with Nathan, the mayor, and some residents. No press, no fanfare, just people moving into homes they could afford. Mason stood in the courtyard of the final building, watching families carry in boxes, and felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with architecture. Nathan walked over. You should be proud. I am. I mean it, Mason. What you've built here, it's going to change lives for decades. That's not small. I know. I'm just still getting used to it. Nathan clapped him on the shoulder. Get used to it, because we've got 6 more projects lined up, and I need you on all of them. Tobachi. Mason laughed. I'll try not to mess them up. You won't. I trust you. Those 3 words, I trust you, hit harder than Mason expected. For years, he'd believed he'd never hear them again, that he'd always be the architect who destroyed a project, the father who couldn't provide, the man who'd lost everything. But standing here, watching his buildings fill with people who needed them, Mason realized he'd been wrong about himself. He wasn't defined by his worst moment. He was defined by what he'd built after. That night, Victoria came over. Sophie was at a friend's house for a sleepover, her first ever, and Mason and Victoria had the house to themselves. They sat on the porch, watching the sunset, and Victoria looked at him. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About us. About what happens next. Mason's stomach tightened. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want to keep pretending this is temporary. I don't want to keep going home to my house every night when I'd rather be here, with you and Sophie. Mason's heart was pounding. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to move in, if you'll have me. Mason stared at her, and for a moment the fear came rushing back. The fear that if he let her this close, she'd see all the broken parts he hadn't fixed, that she'd realize he wasn't worth staying for. But then he looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd already seen him broken and stayed anyway. Who'd fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. Who'd made his life bigger and brighter just by being in it. Yeah, Mason said, his voice rough. I'll have you. Victoria smiled and Mason pulled her close. And they sat there on the porch as the sky turned gold and pink and the neighborhood settled into evening quiet. Summer came, and with it, the rhythm of a life Mason had never thought he'd have. He worked on new projects, spent weekends with Sophie and Victoria, fixed up the house bit by bit until it looked almost unrecognizable from the rundown place he'd moved into a year ago. Sophie turned 8. They threw a party in the backyard. Victoria helped plan it. Ruth brought cake. Nathan and his family showed up, and Sophie's new friends ran around the yard playing games and laughing. Mason stood in the kitchen, watching through the window, and felt Victoria's arms wrap around him from behind. "Happy?" she asked. "Yeah, I really am." "Good, because I am too." Mason turned to face her. "I never thought I'd get here. A year ago, I was barely surviving, and now you're living." "Yeah, I guess I am." Victoria kissed him, and Mason held her, and outside, Sophie's laughter drifted through the open window. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Sophie was asleep, Mason sat on the porch with Victoria. The neighborhood was quiet, the air warm and still. "I've been thinking," Mason said. "About what?" "About how we teach people what they deserve. Sophie spent years watching me struggle, watching me take jobs I hated, watching me accept less because I thought that was all I could have. And I don't want that for her. I want her to grow up knowing she deserves more. That she deserves people who stay, work that matters, a life that feels full." Victoria squeezed his hand. "She's learning that now because you're showing her." "I hope so. Then she is. I see it every day. She's braver because you're brave. She believes in herself because you finally believe in yourself." Mason felt tears prickling his eyes. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For staying when it would have been easier to walk away." Victoria turned to face him, her expression serious. "Mason, I didn't stay because it was easy. I stayed because you're worth it. And I need you to understand that. You're not a project I fixed. You're a person I love, and I'm not going anywhere." Mason pulled her close, and they sat there together, two people who'd been broken in different ways, who'd found each other in a rundown house on Maple Ridge and built something neither of them had believed was possible. The truth, Mason was starting to understand, was that life didn't give you happy endings. It gave you moments, small, fragile, easily missed, where everything aligned just right and you felt, for just a second, like you were exactly where you belonged. This was one of those moments, and Mason wasn't going to let it slip away. By the time winter came again, Mason's life looked nothing like it had a year ago. The house was fully renovated. Sophie was thriving. Victoria had officially moved in, her things mixed with theirs, her presence woven into the fabric of their daily life. Mason's work had expanded. He designed housing projects in 3 different cities, spoken at architecture conferences, been featured in national publications. His name meant something again, not scandal, not failure, but innovation and compassion. On New Year's Eve, they went back downtown to watch the fireworks. Sophie was bigger now, too big to sit on Mason's shoulders, but she stood between him and Victoria, holding both their hands. When midnight came and the fireworks exploded overhead, Mason looked at the 2 people beside him. The daughter who'd never stopped believing in him, the woman who'd taught him how to stop surviving and start living, and realized something profound. He'd spent years thinking that success meant getting back what he'd lost. But standing here, watching the sky fill with light, Mason understood that he'd been wrong. Success wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about building something new. He'd lost his career, his reputation, his belief in himself. But he'd gained something more valuable, a family that wasn't bound by blood, but by choice. A home that wasn't defined by walls, but by the people inside it. A life that felt full, even in its imperfection. The truth was, nobody got to rewrite their worst chapters. The mistakes stayed. The scars remained, the painful memories didn't disappear just because things got better. But you could write new chapters. Better ones. Chapters where you stopped running from your past and started building your future. Where you let people in even when it scared you. Where you fought for what mattered instead of accepting what was easy. Mason had learned that the hard way, and he wouldn't trade that lesson for anything. "Happy New Year," Victoria said, kissing him. "Happy New Year," Mason replied. Sophie hugged both of them, and they stood there in the cold, surrounded by strangers celebrating, and Mason felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile kind that breaks at the first sign of trouble, but the steady, resilient kind that survives because it's built on truth. The truth that life is hard, that people fail, that nothing is guaranteed. But also the truth that sometimes, if you're lucky and you fight hard enough and you let the right people help you, you get a second chance. And sometimes that second chance is better than the first. Mason looked at Sophie and Victoria, at the fireworks painting the sky, at the city spread out below them full of buildings and lives and stories still being written. He thought about the families living in the homes he'd designed, about the projects still ahead, about the man he'd become through years of loss and struggle and eventual rebuilding. And he smiled, because for the first time in his life, Mason Reed wasn't just surviving. He was home.